Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere. That podcast where that one guy tells stories about growing up in Wyoming? Yeah, that's this podcast. Before we get started today, though, here are a few messages from our sponsors. We're sponsored by the Copper Corner Cafe in Basin, Wyoming. The Copper Corner Cafe is open for breakfast and lunch Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Stop by and try any of their delicious menu items featuring homemade bread for all sandwiches. Ooh, that sounds good to me. And of course, their famous pie for dessert. Breakfast is served all day, so come on in to the Copper Corner Cafe. We are also sponsored by the Wyoming Welcome Program. The Wyoming Welcome Program offers two services to local businesses: Table Talk and the Wyoming Welcome Baskets. Wyoming Welcome Baskets are filled with promotional items for local businesses and distributed to new move-ins to the Bighorn Basin. Table Talk brochures include jokes, facts about the state of Wyoming, the month's holidays, and advertisements from our local businesses. These brochures are placed on restaurant tables in Cody and Powell for diners to peruse. So if you'd like to get your business name out there, please contact the folks at the Wyoming Welcome Program by shooting an email to HaleyJ, that's HALEYJ, at wyomingwelcome.com. Do you have a noxious weed problem? The team at 307 Pest Management can help. We offer residential and commercial noxious weed management that is safe and affordable. Whether you have a parking lot, a yard, or some production land that needs treated for noxious weeds, 307 Pest Management is ready to help get your weeds under control. Give them a call today for a free quote at 307-250-0614 or send an email to 307pestmanagement@gmail.com. Well, the holidays are over. It's kind of sad, and the other day I was thinking how I have all of the month of January staring me down, but it's going to be okay. You know, it has cooled off some, but the weather is still nice enough that it's not prohibitive, and you can get out still and do some things. I know the pheasant hunters were out just before Christmas, and there's a competition. I believe it's run out of Lovell where you can take in your feathers, tail feathers, and the longest one receives a prize. So we've been skeet shooting a lot over the holiday as a family. Went down and spent it in Otto, and it was a lot of fun. My dad has gotten a new automatic skeet thrower. Well, I guess it's like a mechanical one where you just step on a foot pedal and it throws out skeet. It hasn't helped me become a better skeet thrower or shooter, I don't think. I don't know. I'm not the greatest skeet shooter. I don't own my own shotgun and I don't have a lot of experience, but I don't know. Shooting all this skeet this weekend has made me wonder if I should get a shotgun of my own. So I hope you had an amazing holiday and that 2026 is off to a great start. I'm excited to begin this year with an exciting announcement. The podcast, Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere, just passed the 5,000 download mark. And this is a huge milestone that we are super excited about. I honestly never really thought the podcast would make it this far. And while 5,000 downloads isn't an enormous number, it is a big milestone for us. And I just want to thank all of the listeners out there who made this possible. And I sure hope that you'll continue to listen and share with your friends. And I'm going to do my best to continue providing stories that will tickle your funny bone and bring a little bit of the outdoors into your life. I also want to mention a story that I heard in response to the episode about getting stuck. My friend Jane here in Powell told me about going north of town and getting her pickup stuck after work, and she was in her work clothes from the school, had to have someone come pull her out, and got both vehicles stuck. So I just want to give Jane a shout out and congratulate her on getting stuck. This was about a level 3, so that takes some effort, Jane. But thank you for listening, and I hope that you will all reach out and share stories. I love to hear your stories just as much as you love to hear mine. So, speaking of stories, here is a brand new one that I'm excited to share. Oh, and one more thing before I get going. I wanted to mention that the podcast will now drop an episode every Saturday, beginning in 2026. So there's this episode this week. Next week, we will run another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere, and we're going to be retelling some of our past stories on those off Saturdays, and then releasing a brand new story on the other Saturdays. But it does mean that you can listen to Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere every Saturday. So, here goes our latest story, The Disturbing Case of a Bad Burrito. I admit it, I hate getting sick. Few things are more frustrating or demoralizing than a cold, the flu, or COVID-19. That being said, the worst illness of all is the stomach flu. I absolutely hate nausea and losing my cookies. I have discovered through sad experience that being sick can be made even worse depending on your circumstances and location. Getting a head cold on a weekend at home is an inconvenience, but is often little more than that. You get to shuffle around the house in your pajamas and slippers, whining to anyone who will listen about how miserable you feel. You go through a box of tissues and probably take a nap. But get a cold, say, on a week-long pack trip, and you really know the meaning of misery. Nothing exacerbates suffering in the outdoors like being sick. At a time when you were already yearning for your own bed and a home-cooked meal, you find yourself wiping your nose on your sleeves, your extra clothes, and your horse. If you're really desperate, you might break into the toilet paper you packed, but that's just asking for trouble. My friend Mark Crawfry told me once about a time he flew out to Texas to go jabalina hunting with some buddies. He flew out of Cody, so the flight wasn't exactly a Boeing 747. If you've ever been to the Cody airport, you know it consists of exactly one terminal, one gate, and one airline. United flies a modest aircraft into Cody from Denver in the morning, and it turns around and flies back. There are only 4 flights and 4 arrivals in Cody each day, and they are all between Cody and Denver. Mark was scheduled to get on the flight headed out around 2:45 in the afternoon. When he left his house in Powell at 1, he felt fine. He had his rifle in a case to be checked at the airport, and to carry on with a few changes of clothes and his hunting camo. In his rush to get out the door, he didn't eat lunch, so he grabbed a gas station burrito on the way out of town. As he drove the 30 minutes from Powell to Cody, he envisioned the hunt in Texas between bites of the burrito. He had always heard about jabalina hunting, but he had never tried it. He almost laughed with excitement, imagining hunting hogs with an infrared scope. By the time he had finished his burrito, he had ridden southern Texas of half the invasive population of skunk pigs. But while Mark was planning his big hunt, his digestive tract was also making plans for rebellion. Mark arrived at the airport and parked his truck in the extended stay parking lot. He left the burrito wrapper balled up in the cup holder of the truck and quickly forgot about it. A chilly breeze threatened to remove his ball cap as he made his way into the terminal. If he had been watching, he probably would have noticed how the big statue of a grizzly bear watched him with doleful eyes as he entered the building. But poor Mark had no idea what was about to hit him. Of course, he had plenty of time to check his rifle and navigate security before boarding. He barely had to wait in line. He pulled off his boots and put them in a tray, then coiled his belt up in the same one. He hoisted his carry-on up and onto the rollers, then waited for an elderly lady who asked a TSA officer if she needed to remove her earrings, because she wouldn't, no matter who told her to take them off. These were her mother's earrings, and she wasn't about to let some underpaid TSA officer steal them. Flying was such a hassle, she said. Why did they have to make everything so hard, for goodness sake? Imagine someone taking me for a terrorist, she blustered. Mark just shook his head and looked past her bluish hair to where the plane was parked out on the tarmac. His mind was a few hundred miles away in the cactus and sand of the Rio Grande. The woman finally wobbled into the body scanner, where she had to be instructed repeatedly to put her arms over her head. "What? Am I being arrested? Put my hands up, you say?" she fumed before finally lifting her arms over her head. Mark shared a knowing look with the TSA officer on the other side of the scanner as the old lady shuffled past. The black buttons on the officer's blue uniform glinted in the overhead fluorescent lighting as he waved Mark forward with a rubber-gloved hand. When Mark raised his arms over his head and looked straight ahead at the cartoon image of a man in the same position, there was a sudden twinge in his gut. Barely noticeable, but there. After he dropped his arms, the twinge was gone, and though Mark's brows furrowed for a moment, the feeling was soon forgotten. As the old lady was haranguing another officer about the inconvenience of having to put her shoes back on. "When I put them on this morning, I had no intention of taking them off until I went to bed, you know," she grumbled, sliding one foot into the white Velcro sneaker. When Mark was forced to wait to retrieve his belongings while the woman struggled with the second shoe, a TSA officer on the other side of the rollers said, "Ma'am, if you could just move ahead, there are benches over there where you can sit while you put on your shoes." "Oh, is that supposed to make this more convenient?" she thundered. "We'll just provide some benches, and that will distract people from the fact they're being stripped of their privacy." Finally, Mark was able to retrieve his things, and he slid the tray containing his boots and personal effects to the end of the rollers and pulled his boots on. After replacing his shoes, cell phone, and wallet, he stacked the tray and yanked his carry-on from the table. He refilled his plastic water bottle at a convenient fountain with a bottle filler and surveyed the small waiting room. The single gate, which sported the unnecessary designation of Gate A1, was surrounded by a couple rows of those black chairs that are specially designed to be uncomfortable. Mark sank into an empty spot where he could check his phone. "Did you make it?" read the text from his wife, Jane. "Yes, sitting at the gate," Mark texted back. Then he shot a text to his buddy in Texas. "About to board. Should be in El Paso at 10. He checked the weather in El Paso. A high of 79. It sounded good to him. After a few minutes of reading his Louis L'Amour novel, the call came to board. Mark heaved himself to his feet and joined the other passengers forming a line in front of the gate. Through the window, he could see mountains in the distance, rising above the yellow grass of the plains. A young man wearing a Denver Nuggets jersey, skinny black jeans, and chunky skater shoes stood in front of him, his head bobbing in time to whatever music was blasting through the expensive-looking headphones that engulfed his head. The scanner beeped ahead of him as people scanned their boarding passes. When Mark's turn came, he held his phone with his digital pass up to the scanner and smiled at the United agent. "Have a nice flight," she said with a welcoming smile. You too, Mark replied, and immediately felt like a fool. As soon as he had entered the gate, he slapped a hand to his forehead. You too? She's not flying. You are. Mark shook his head and made his way outside to the waiting ramp that was wheeled up to the small jet, his carry-on bag bouncing along behind him. The flight from Cody, Wyoming to Denver, Colorado is a short haul, approximately 391 miles. The duration of the flight is typically around 2 hours, though it can be less with a healthy tailwind. Unfortunately for Mark, his flight was about to feel much longer than that, mostly due to a much different kind of tailwind. When Mark climbed aboard, he was greeted by a smiling stewardess clad in a well-pressed business coat and black skirt. He glanced down at the ticket on his phone screen to double-check his seat. He had 6D, a window seat. That was fine with him. He loved watching the scenery and looking out at the clouds during the flight. Mark enjoyed flying, though he didn't get to do it that often. He had been looking forward to this trip for a long time, and he couldn't understand people who hated flying or found it boring. Before taking his seat, he paused to hoist his carry-on into an empty space in the overhead luggage compartment. After situating his suitcase, he noticed the elderly woman he had seen in security standing with her own suitcase at the luggage compartment down the aisle from him. Her short height and her age combined to make lifting a roller bag up above her head a daunting task, and he could tell by the look in her eyes she could use some help. Here, he said. Let me give you a hand with that. Oh, thank you, the old lady replied. You're the first kind person I've met all day. Mark grabbed the handle on the top of her bag and swung it up toward the luggage compartment. Immediately, he noticed two things. 1, the bag was much lighter than he anticipated, and 2, the end with the wheels had just connected with the old lady's face. Oof, the lady grunted as the bag thudded against her. So sorry, Mark immediately called out. By the time Mark and the flight crew had helped the old lady into her seat, and she had assured everyone a couple hundred times that she was just fine, thank you very much, Mark was starting to wonder if this trip might not have been such a good idea after all. He made his way back to his own seat, and when he arrived, found that the aisle seat had been filled in his absence. An attractive woman in her mid-30s was seated when Mark arrived. She wore a western blouse and an expensive-looking necklace, paired with dark blue jeans and designer cowboy boots. Mark gulped. Excuse me, he said. I'm 60. You don't look a day over 35, the woman replied, and flashed a grin that made Mark's knees wobble. Mark stuttered, his brain and his mouth suddenly losing contact with one another. The woman threw her head back and laughed, then undid her seatbelt and stood. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he came face to face with the woman. I'm glad to see you can take a joke. Here, take your seat. Thanks, Mark finally choked out, detecting a hint of the woman's floral perfume as he sidestepped by her to his seat. He slid his backpack off and sank down next to the window, and the woman retook her own seat. Lilac. Her perfume was definitely lilac. I'm glad that lady is all right, the woman said, turning to Mark. Mark's face reddened. Yeah, I feel terrible about that. I don't usually hit old ladies. She let fly with another peal of laughter, and Mark gripped his armrest as his heart fluttered in his chest. I know it was an accident, the woman said. I guess no good deed goes unpunished, huh? Yeah, Mark nodded, suddenly wishing he had combed his hair that morning. Or brushed his teeth. Or worn a different shirt. In fact, he was starting to wish he could take back every decision he had made that day. He was rethinking being born. "Cassidy," she said, extending a hand with immaculate nails. "Mark," Mark grunted, taking her hand and giving it a handshake he hoped was appropriate for the situation. How do you shake a beautiful woman's hand? Mark wondered. At least he had washed it that morning. Or at least he was pretty sure he had washed it. He was sure he had thought about washing it. Just then the speaker crackled to life above them. "Welcome aboard United Flight 5087, full service to Denver. This CRJ-200 is equipped with twin jet engines and will reach a cruising altitude of 10,000 feet. We are expecting a flight time of about 2 hours. Please take your seats and prepare for an on-time departure. As always, thank you for flying United." Shh. Mark pulled the safety card out of the seat back in front of him, just for an excuse to do anything but look at Cassidy. In front of them, the stewardess began her safety presentation, and Cassidy pulled out her phone and pecked at the screen with her dainty fingers. Suddenly, Mark felt a tightening in his gut, like someone had grabbed his lower intestine and wrapped it around a stick. Mark winced, but the feeling was gone as suddenly as it had come. He gave his head a quick shake and put the safety card back into the pocket. He fished his water bottle from the side pocket of his backpack and took a swig before replacing it and sliding it under the seat in front of him. "Please make sure all devices are in airplane mode and stowed before takeoff," the stewardess said, coming down the aisle. "Yes, of course," Cassidy said, and slid her phone into a pocket. The plane bounced slightly as it taxied out onto the runway. "Crew, please prepare the cabin for takeoff," the pilot said over the PA system. Now the plane was picking up speed, and Mark was shocked to find that Cassidy had suddenly tensed and gripped the armrests of her seat. Her hand was gripping another hand, and he looked down to discover it was in fact his own. She was holding his hand on the armrest between them and squeezing it like a country kid catching a horny toad. Mark glanced over to find that her eyes were closed and she was muttering under her breath, "It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine." Mark's eyes widened, and he glanced down at Cassidy's hand holding his and back up at her. He hadn't felt so many butterflies during a takeoff since the first time he flew. After a few moments, the plane leveled off, and Cassidy's grip loosened, and the woman's body relaxed. She heaved a deep sigh and opened her eyes. "Oh, sorry," she gasped, pulling her hand away from Mark's. "I get so nervous when we're taking off. I hate flying." "No worries," Mark said with a cough. "I completely understand," he lied. After seeing how Cassidy acted during takeoff, Mark found himself worrying about how the landing would go. But these worries were soon replaced by a new one. The butterflies he felt at takeoff didn't seem to be going away. In fact, he realized as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the butterflies were acting more like hornets at the moment, and he couldn't help but grunt in discomfort. "I just have watched too many airplane movies, you know," Cassidy was saying. "They always seem to be crashing, and in the news it seems like every other day a plane is going down. It's just so terrifying." "Excuse me," Mark said with a grimace, and unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose, his head ducked to avoid hitting the luggage compartment above him, and he sidestepped awkwardly past Cassidy. Sweat was starting to bead on his forehead, and the hornets pounding in his gut were working their way south with a vengeance. He glanced down the aisle and saw the sign for the lavatory. Just as he was getting ready to make a desperate break for the bathroom at the back of the plane, a voice behind him said, "Excuse me, sir, but I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat. The captain has not turned off the fasten seatbelt sign." Mark turned to see the stewardess standing behind him, a stern expression on her face. "So sorry," Mark said, wincing as a new spasm racked his gut. "It's just that Really, sir, I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We haven't reached cruising altitude." Chagrined, Mark slid apologetically back past Cassidy and sank into his seat, casting a desperate look back over his shoulder toward the bathroom. A hideous gurgle emanated from his gut. "Are you okay?" Cassidy said, glancing nervously toward Mark. This wasn't exactly the image he would have hoped to cultivate with the well-dressed cowgirl, but Mark was helpless to contain the monster raging in his belly. "I'm all right," Mark said, sounding more confident than he felt. He wiped at the sweat on his forehead and clicked his seatbelt back into place. He had never needed a bathroom with more intensity in his entire life, and he found his whole body tensing under the pressure. "Are you feeling all right?" Cassidy asked uncertainly. "Well, I think I might have gotten a bad Maverick burrito," Mark grunted. "I'm so sorry," Cassidy gushed, a look of worry contorting her face. "I'm sure they'll turn off the seatbelt sign soon." But Mark wasn't listening. With a grim look of determination, he was staring straight ahead, trying desperately to contain whatever convenience store creation was bellowing to get out of his gut. His fingers dug into the armrest of the seat, and another ominous gurgle came from his lower abdomen. "What was that?" Cassidy asked. "Are you okay?" Mark couldn't hold out any longer. Every man has a breaking point, and he had found his. Try as he might, he couldn't stop what happened next. The sound of flatulence was ear-shattering. The fact that Mark was trying so hard to contain the gas almost certainly contributed to the volume of the fart when it came. Instantly, the cloud of noxious fumes spread out from Mark, and Cassidy was stopped mid-sentence. "Can I get you something? I have a—" Her expression suddenly clouded, and a fit of coughing and retching racked her petite frame. "I'm so sorry," Mark muttered, his face going red as a cherry tomato. In front of Mark, people began to cover their faces with sleeves, napkins, whatever they could get their hands on. "Oh, heaven help us!" wailed a woman behind Mark. He was suddenly seized with a desire to disappear that was almost rivaled by the relief of lessening the pressure in his gut. As Cassidy coughed, Mark sank down into his seat, trying to avoid the glares of those around him. Just as Mark was congratulating himself on at least averting a disaster that would have resulted in a change of pants, another rumble came from his gut. Mark froze like a raccoon caught digging through a dumpster and turned slowly to look over at Cassidy. Her nose was buried in her fancy shirt, and at the sound of more gastric disturbance coming from the next seat over, her eyes widened in horror. She shook her head frantically and began fumbling with her seatbelt with one hand in a desperate attempt to escape. Too late. If the first fart was nasty, the second was absolutely putrid. Mark wouldn't have been surprised to see a green haze floating up from his nether parts. Even he began to cough. What kind of diabolical burrito had he consumed? The agony returned, and Mark began to wonder if he was going to survive much longer. The other passengers of the small plane were wondering the same thing. "Please, make it stop," someone moaned ahead of Mark. They were less than 10 minutes into the flight, and things were already looking grim. Just when Mark thought he couldn't last another second, the green seatbelt sign above him suddenly went dark. Mark had never seen a more welcome sight in his entire life. Like a wet cat released from a washing machine, he tore out of his seat, not even bothering to excuse himself as he squeezed past the unfortunate Cassidy. With all the dignity of a drunken sailor, Mark staggered down the aisle to the bathroom and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the green vacant sign displayed. He placed a hand on the sign and gave the door a push. "Come on," he growled through gritted teeth, trying again. As panic set in, he pushed desperately on the handle, the door rattling as he banged on it. "You have to push in the middle, sir," a voice said behind him, coming from the ever-present stewardess, who now viewed him with a certain level of fascination, horror, and perhaps disgust. "Oh, yeah," Mark grunted, and pushed in the center of the door. It folded inward and to the left, and he slid gratefully inside the tiny bathroom. An in-depth description of what happened next would be scarring to some readers. Let's just say Mark discovered the true meaning of bunfire. Outside the bathroom, the passengers in the rows adjacent to the lavatory shared glances at first. A bang or two issued from the small space, and some desperate pleading. The only thing worse than the banging was the intermittent flatulence that threatened to rattle the door off its hinges. There was silence for a moment or two, and the travelers in row 17 heaved a sigh of relief. But then they heard a quavering voice, muffled only slightly by the thin walls and folding door, whimper, "Oh no, no more, please, no more." The concerned expressions of passengers turned to outright horror. Now the wailing began, only to be drowned out by a splattering sound and more banging. At last, the cacophony emanating from the little room subsided, and a tense silence spread across the rear of the plane. The stewardess relieved her white-knuckle grip on the coffee pot, only to realize she had poured the entire contents into a single cup, and a pool of coffee was spreading on the floor. A mother removed her hands from the ears of her teenage son. Slowly, the door creaked open, and a pale and shaking Mark emerged. He stumbled out the door and had made his way slowly back to his seat, supporting himself on the backs of other seats as he went. Every eye followed his progress warily down the aisle. When Mark finally reached row 6, his brow was drenched in sweat, and he looked like a patient emerging from a protracted surgery. Cassidy's eyes were wide, and she sat silently as he shuffled past her and crumpled into his seat like a used hanky. She watched him as if she expected him to spontaneously combust at any moment. Maybe it would have been best if he did. For his part, Mark pushed the little button on his chair and reclined about 2 degrees. His eyes were closed as he heaved a shaky sigh. His rest was short-lived. To the horror of Mark and all the other passengers, the whole episode was repeated 3 more times during the flight, with each trip to the lavatory worse than the first. When Mark's gastric distress had finally abated, he collapsed, completely spent, into a fitful sleep. Above him, the seatbelt sign blinked on. "This is your captain speaking," crackled the PA system. "We are beginning our descent into Denver. Please return to your seats and put up your tray tables." The landing was unusually rough due to a storm in the Denver area. But even as the plane pitched and bucked, finally touching down with a bang on the runway, Cassidy's hands remained clenched in her lap. Under different circumstances, Mark might have even noticed. Well, there you have it. The disturbing case of a bad burrito. Before you ask, this story is not actually based on an actual experience like a lot of my other stories. And I made this one completely up. So if you're a friend out there listening to the podcast, wondering if I'm describing an unfortunate experience you had on an airplane, no, I am not. This one, it just came to me after a series of illnesses during the holiday that I don't care to describe. I thought that this might be a good topic for a story. And when I was discussing the episode with my mom, she said there are probably people who can relate. She told me about a time they went from Wyoming to Idaho and didn't bring anything to eat, and they had a young child in the car. They stopped at Walmart and ordered a hamburger and a hot dog and watched as the employee popped both into the microwave, and nobody ate those burgers or the hot dog. So that was probably a wise decision and may have averted an experience like the one described in this story. If you have an experience with air sickness or getting sick at an inconvenient time, I'd love to hear about it. You can shoot me an email at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com, or you can respond on Facebook when this episode drops. Please consider rating or reviewing our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to subscribe. Your review and your subscription make it easier for the podcast to be found. And like I mentioned, there will be another episode dropping next Saturday and every Saturday after that, as Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere is now a weekly podcast. Thanks so much for your support. It's been a pleasure sharing this story with you. And as always, this has been another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much and still find time for the important things, like fishing. See you next time, folks.